Hello, my name is Don Corleone, and today I'm going to show you how to build crushing exploitative strategies using node locking. Before we get into it, please make sure to like and subscribe. It helps us bring more great content to you. Let's talk about incentives. What are incentives? Well, GTO strategies are in a very fragile state of equilibrium, meaning if your opponent deviates from a GTO Nash equilibrium strategy, even slightly, our highest possible EV strategy is going to change drastically. Today, we're going to talk about how to use the node lock function on GTO Wizard to learn about how those incentives affect our strategy. And hopefully, then we can apply this knowledge on the table. Before that though, let's make a distinction between a setup and a punish. A setup exploit consists on manipulating your range that gets into that mistake that your opponent is making, that deviation that they are making from the GTO solution. So any kind of adjustment we do before they make the mistake, let's say our opponents raise the flop too much, then changing our c-bet strategy in order to adjust to that would be, in this case, a setup. A punish, on the other hand, is whatever adjustment we make after they've made the mistake. So in this particular example of them raising the flop too much, well, we would c-bet with a different range, and then after we get raised, we're also going to respond differently than how we would respond against a perfect GTO solution. Let's start with an example. This is blind versus blind single raise pot, Queen 8-3 two-tone, and we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of the small blind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to force the big blind to stab the flop too often, and this is going to cause the small blind to adjust in certain ways. To do that, I'm going to click on this node, open the node lock function. I'm going to increase the betting frequency, let's say to around 48%. I'm going to lock it, and I'm going to click node lock. Now, if you want to learn how to use the node lock function step by step, there's another video on GTO Wizard's YouTube channel that you can watch. So, as I said, the small blind is going to adjust its strategy in different ways to exploit this leak. I'm going to give you a few options. Some of them are going to be true, some of them are not, and you have to decide which ones are. A, we call with weaker hands. B, we fold more with weak hands. C, we bluff raise more. D, we value raise more. And E, we check more with good hands. So let's go back to the c-bet node. As we can see, the c-bet frequency has decreased by a lot. Now we're almost checking every hand, although not quite. Now, just by looking at this visually, even if we click on the compare nodes and we look at the original c-bet strategy, we can see that the frequency has been reduced, but it's hard to tell in which ways it has been reduced. So is it now that the betting range is stronger or the checking range is stronger? What happened? If we click check and now we compare the big blind to the original one, we can see that the equity, especially if we go to the equity tab, we can see that the equities have changed. Now, what does this mean? Well, if big blind's equity has changed after the small blind checks, that means that the small blind checking range is different, is either stronger or weaker, because the big blind's range is now lower equity than before. We can infer that the small blind's checking range is stronger. Okay, so one of the exploits that the small blind is applying is it's checking more often with good hands. That's what would constitute the setup exploit. If we go to the node after the big blind stabs, we're going to see a very, very high check raising frequency, 23.7%, and a pretty low folding frequency, 21.9%. If we compare to the previous node, we can see it has changed drastically. This strategy now is what I would call the punish in this case. And if we go to strategy, here we can see the difference in frequencies, and we can see that the check raising has increased by a significant amount. It used to be 7.6%, now it's 23.7%. the folds have been reduced, but that doesn't mean that weak hands are calling more or less. As you can see, the threshold for what hands call or fold is basically the same, right? The same hands are calling or folding. It's just that the left-hand side range is much stronger overall, right? We checked more with good hands. And so now, even if we call the same hands and fold the same hands, we are going to end up with a much lower folding frequency. So the A and B statements were not true necessarily. We don't either call more with weak hands or call less. We do value raise more. As you can see, ace 8, ace 3 are raising a lot more. We do bluff raise more in order to balance out that increase in value. And we check more with good hands. Those are the three ways in which the solver is exploiting the particular leak that we forced onto the big blind. Let's go back to the original setup. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to force the opposite leak. I'm going to make the big blind stab too infrequently. I'm going to reduce stabbing. I'm going to lock it. Click no lock. And let's see how the small blind adjusts its c-bet range. As we can see, the frequency hasn't changed all that much. But if we go to the big blind and we compare the equities, we see that the big blind's equity right now is higher, which means that the small blind's checking range is now weaker. Okay, so we have weakened our checking range in order to exploit a low amount of aggression in a certain line. If now we go to the node after the big blind stabs, we see not only a reduction in check raises, but a complete lack of them. If we compare the strategies to before, we see that, once again, there has been a reduction in check raises down to basically 0. And now we're folding more versus the bet. Now, again, it's not necessarily the case that we are folding different hands. Right? We're folding basically the same hands. But we have created a checking range that is more weighted towards weak hands. And therefore, we end up folding more. So, the incentives can be summarized in these 4 points. In terms of setup exploits, what we care is future aggression and future amount of folds. In other words, we care about how much money is going into the pot in that line. If too much money is going into the pot, we want to take that line with a stronger range. If not enough money is going into the pot, we want to play that line with a weaker range. And we could do this in multiple ways. We could change the range by adding more bluffs, removing bluffs, adding strong hands, removing strong hands. You have to be creative. When it comes to the punish exploits, what we care about ultimately is how strong your opponent's range is. If your opponent's range is too weak compared to GTO, then we will increase our aggression and calling. If your opponent's range is too strong compared to GTO, we will decrease our aggression and calling. Remember to stack the setup exploits and the punish exploits, and you can even go back one or multiple streets and start setting up a really strong exploit to take maximum advantage of your opponent's mistakes. To summarize, exploitation is based on incentives. When it comes to setting up our range for success, what we care is our opponent going to put in too much money or too little money into the pot in that particular line? When it comes to the punish exploits, what we care about is whether our opponent's range is too strong or too weak. Be creative. There are multiple ways in which you can manipulate your range to be stronger or weaker, and you can stack multiple exploits to take maximum advantage of your opponent, even multiple streets before the mistake even happens. That's all for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.